So let's talk about an interesting observation. I love making political observations. I love looking at history and then comparing what I read in history to what is taking place today. And one thing that I have observed in my study of history, in my perusing of various books on historical epochs, is that younger people many times will try to be more extreme and more radical than the older generation. So today you have Republican boomers and you have Democrat boomers. And the Republican boomers and the Democrat boomers, they will disagree. All the time they disagree, right? I mean, it's part of their polarizing existence that they disagree. It's just inevitable. But while they disagree, they at the same time will have some form of moderation. They will not go down the road of the extreme application of their beliefs. So, for example, you have Republican boomers, and Republican boomers will say things like, well, I disagree with illegal immigration, but at the same time, I have no problem with people who come here legally. If you come here legally and you did it the right way, the legal way, then I have no issue with you. I just don't like illegal immigration or something like that. And then you have the Democrat boomers, and these people will say things like, well, I think we should definitely help the poor. We should have some form of a social safety net. We definitely have to help the working class and give them some extra money from the state through tax dollars. But I don't agree with socialism, or I don't agree with communism or anything like that. And you'll see older Democrats bashing Bernie Sanders. This is why Bernie Sanders, he doesn't make it so much amongst older boomer Democrats who, they come from a background of the Cold War and they don't want anything to do with socialism, or they don't want to vote for someone who has literally said expressions of sympathy towards communist regimes. The Republican boomers, they will say things against illegal immigration, but at the same time, they will be pro-life, and they'll say things like, well, I reject Planned Parenthood. I don't like Planned Parenthood because the founder of Planned Parenthood was a fanatic eugenist. So they have their disagreements, they have their convictions, but they won't go down the far right road or the far left road. Now, if you look at the younger political ideologues that we see in the West today, you will find younger right-wingers who are just downright Nazis, or they are extremely nationalistic, fanatically nationalistic. They will say things sympathetic towards National Socialism. They will say things like, well, we should have socialism, but only for the majority demographic of the country. And then you have the younger lefties who are more in favor for politicians like Bernie Sanders. They don't mind taboo terms like socialism or maybe even communism. They will promote ideas like anarcho-communism. You find younger right-wingers who will promote ideas like anarcho-capitalism, which is really just a eugenic ideology. And both of these people, young lefties and young righties, they will promote eugenic ideas. That's why you will hear leftists say things like, well, those pro-life Christians, they're just a threat to the species or something like that. Or you'll have right-wingers like Richard Spencer say things like, well, yeah, I am a right-winger, but I completely support abortion because, well, abortion makes sure, it guarantees that the black population doesn't get too big. And yes, Richard Spencer actually did say this. So you're seeing the younger people becoming more and more fanatical. They are taking the ideological paradigms of the older generation and they are expanding them. And by expanding them, I mean they are surpassing that Overton window. They are going beyond what is acceptable. They are spitting on taboos, and they are taking for example, moderate conservatism or moderate liberalism, and they are applying them in the most fanatical way. And we are actually seeing this, especially on the internet. A lot of things start on the internet. They start out as memes, but then they manifest into reality. That's why they say Donald Trump was the very first president to be memed into a presidential victory. And it's true. That's why the Trump campaign used memes. And we saw this with people like Milo or people like, a lot of these troll types. It was very, very common. And so we see the younger generation becoming more fanatical than the older generation. And we can see historical parallels to this. For example, in the late 17th or late 18th century, so late 1700s, there were philosophers who were pushing ideas that would be akin to Darwinism or evolutionism. People like Voltaire and Rousseau and Erasmus Darwin, they would push ideas that were very much that were very akin to evolutionism. They came up with ideas like, well, maybe we evolved from lower species or lower primates, etc., etc. And then, in the later successive generations, you have people like Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin actually learned from his, I think it was his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. And Erasmus Darwin was pushing evolutionism in the late 18th century, during the time of the French Revolution. And Darwin takes his grandfather's idea, he takes Erasmus Darwin's idea, and he expands it. And then the nephew of Charles Darwin takes his uncle's theory and then applies it in a more extreme fashion. Because Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, he came up with just a brief description of an idea that he had. Maybe we evolved from lower species. And things evolved through death, through the weak dying, survival of the fittest, essentially. And then Charles Darwin takes this idea and he expands it into two large volumes, The Descent of Man and The Origin of Species. And he, in a way, codifies this idea as a scientific system. And part of this scientific system, or really the center of this scientific system, is that we evolved through killing each other. The strong kills off the weak's genetics disappear, they are no longer in existence, and the genes of the strong perpetuate themselves, and they continue to evolve into another species. And eventually we are going to evolve into some sort of Übermensch, into some sort of a Superman, whatever. It's a crazy-ass idea. But then Galton, Charles Darwin's nephew, Francis Galton, Galton takes his uncle's idea and he says, well, since we evolve through making sure that certain people don't breed, then we should take evolutionism and apply it as a political policy. So what do we see here? We see generations becoming more and more fanatical as they appear. We find successive generations becoming more and more fanatical. And we see this. We see this. It's like if you look at people in the 1600s or people in the early 1700s, you will find fanatics. You will find people with anti-Christian ideas, revolutionary ideas, socialistic ideas. You will find these things. But then all of a sudden you start reading about the late 1700s and you read about a guy named Marquis de Sade, who wrote the most horrendous, degenerate, violent, sadistic books you can ever imagine. His last name, de Sade, is actually where we get the word sadism from. What happened there? You see the generations getting worse, becoming more and more fanatical. So today, in our own time, we find boomers who have their own ideas, but then we find millennials who have much more fanatical ideas. And then we have Zoomers who have way more fanatical ideas than millennials. So what is actually taking place? The successive generations are growing more and more fanatical as they go. And we sit here and bash the boomers like they're the worst people in the world. And yes, there is legitimate criticism for the boomer generation, as there is legitimate criticism for every generation, because every generation has its problems and its dysfunctions. Absolutely. But we sit here and act as though the boomers are the worst people in the world. They're selfish, greedy, and yada, yada, yada. And you probably have legitimate criticism for that. But here's the reality. Ultimately, the boomer generation is what is keeping us in order. Because it is the boomer generation that is very interested in Christianity more than the younger generation. It's the boomer generation that has more of an interest in social issues like abortion and fighting gay marriage and things like that, more so than younger people, obviously. It's the boomer generation who says, yeah, I'm a conservative, absolutely. But I'm not like these damn right-wing fanatics over here who love Adolf Hitler or who want to establish a National Socialist state or a ethno-state or whatever. And the boomer generation has most of the wealth, which means they have the political power in the United States. And they still make up the majority voting bloc in the United States. So they still have a tremendous amount of political leverage and influence. But what happens when they eventually die off? And it's going to happen. It's inevitable, right? We all die eventually. So what's going to happen when they die off? What's going to happen is as they die off and as they lose their political influence in voting, we are going to be seeing the rise of political fanaticism. You are going to be seeing the idea of socialism becoming more popular. You're going to be seeing the idea of National Socialism becoming something of an edgy trend. You're already seeing it amongst young people online. You're going to be seeing these things. The fact that so many young people followed a guy like Milo Yiannopoulos, the fact that you had a lot of young people following someone like Richard Spencer, the fact that in Europe, because this is not just happening in the US, this is happening in Europe, the fact that in Europe, so many young people voted for right-wing parties like Forum for Democracy, or they voted for a party like the Freedom Party in Austria, or they voted for someone like Sebastian Kurz, or they voted in favor for more anti-immigration policies in a country like Denmark. The fact that you have had these sorts of phenomena taking place, it really does indicate this reality. And there actually have been trends analysts, people who analyze trends and the vicissitudes of politics as the generations go by. They have actually written reports about how we can actually expect a boom in nationalist ideologies coming from younger generations. We're talking Zoomers, and we're talking a Generation Alpha, and that title for a generation is disturbing enough, regardless if that's not what they meant when they labeled that generation. But still, it's inadvertently creepy, like Generation Alpha, we're the alpha males, kill all the betas. So as generations come into existence, as younger generations are growing older and becoming more and more politically influential, and they start voting and they start talking about politics and they start dominating political dialogue and discourse, we are going to see the world becoming more and more fanatical. It's not just in America or in Western Europe. We are going to be seeing this in Asia as well. In India, you are seeing the rise of, well, you're already seeing Hindu nationalism being extremely popular. And who do you see a lot of, who do you see in a lot of these Hindu nationalist rallies? You see a lot of young people. There are a lot of young people in India who love Hindu nationalism. In Japan, you see also a lot of young people who are ultra-nationalists. Speaking of Japan, this reminds me, what happened after the Meiji era in Japan? The Meiji era was the era in which Japan became an empire. It's the era when Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and also Russia in 1905. So it was a very, very pivotal moment. It was an extremely significant moment in the history of Japan. It's when Japan established itself as an empire and as a world superpower. It was the first Asian country to become a world superpower. And I don't think any Asian country has ever surpassed what Japan has done. Even if you want to bring up, India is not going to surpass Japan. China is a paper dragon. But what happened after the Meiji era? What happened after the Emperor Meiji died? You had the rise of a younger, more fanatical generation. And while the older generation in Japan were very much so active in establishing Japan's position as a world superpower, and while there were a lot of older people who were very much so in support of Japan becoming a world superpower and were very much involved in guiding Japan towards that route, they were not as fanatical as the successive generation, as the younger generation that rose up in politics in Japan. And the younger generation in Japan, when they established themselves in politics and started getting involved in political activities and in political action, they not only wanted Japan to supplant the Chinese, they wanted Japan to become an empire over all of Asia. And that's when you had ideas like Pan-Asianism become very popular. The idea that all of Asia could be united under Japan, under Tokyo. So in that historical epoch, you see the same thing. Younger people being more fanatical than the older generation. So anyway, I've talked enough. I've spoken enough. You guys just heard some oh my God, my English is just, my tongue is not functioning correctly today. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.